All right, now that we are through with the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, we are going to move on to the consequences of this war and the beginning of the causes of the American Revolution. But before that, I want us to just take a few minutes to look at what happened at what is known as the Albany Congress, where there was put forth a plan called the Albany Plan of Union. Now, this is way back at the start of the 7 Years' War in 1754. And this is the first, most detailed plan of colonial union before the actual revolution. And this drawing is Benjamin Franklin's famous drawing relating to this Albany Plan of Union. And basically this Plan of Union was an Indian protection plan to get the colonies to come together to protect themselves against the Native Americans. Now, the colonies that were invited to the Albany Congress were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. I'll say that again. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Colonies further to the south weren't invited because they were viewed as being too far away from the probable cause of the conflict with Native Americans to invite. And New Jersey and Virginia decided just not to come because it seemed too expensive to send delegates, which again tells you how even at a time where people thought there was some kind of crisis or need for a plan of union, that in some cases it didn't even inspire people to join in on this sort of joint colonial effort. So, of the colonies that were at the Albany Congress, only Massachusetts authorized its delegates to go beyond Indian affairs and intercolonial defense to at least discuss the possibility of entering into a union what they called Articles of Union and Confederation with the other colonies that were represented, for purposes, as they put it, this was their instructions, quote, for the general defense of His Majesty's subjects and interests in North America, as well as in times of peace as of war. So Massachusetts is the only colony that includes that provision, but it's not as though the ideas, at least about the possibility of the Union, had never occurred to anyone before that point, and particularly among several people. One of them was this guy, Benjamin Franklin. And in fact, several years before the Albany Plan of Union, actually as early as 1751, Franklin had been one of a number of people who had thought maybe it makes sense to at least think about some way of unifying the colonies. And he'd come up with his own plan. He envisioned some kind of governor general that would sort of preside over this sort of layer of government that would exist over the colonies. And the governor general, he thought, would be paid for by the crown. And then he also saw a kind of general council that would represent all the colonies, and it would be have delegates in it chosen by colonial assemblies. So Franklin invents this thing, 1751, that you could see he's kind of trying to balance royal authority and colonial power. And that's his idea. So now, a few years later, in 1754, the Albany Congress at least investigates the idea of some kind of a union of colonies. And they actually appointed a committee to prepare basically a memorandum outlining what might be a proposed union. And the memorandum has a really 18th century kind of title attached to it. The memorandum is titled, Short Hints Towards a Scheme for a General Union of the British Colonies on the Continent. So clearly they liked long titles. For our purposes, we'll just call it Short Hints. So, Short Hints is this memorandum drawn up by this committee, and Short Hints starts out by setting forth the basic problem of thinking about what to do to even consider some kind of formal colonial union. And what they say at the beginning of this document is, in such a scheme, in a scheme of colonial union, the just prerogative of the crown must be preserved, or it will not be approved and confirmed in England. and the just liberties of the people must be secure, or the several colonies will disapprove of it and oppose it. Okay, so it's a pretty tricky balancing act here between the rights of the colonists and the authority of the crown that this plan of union is trying to create. So to accomplish both of these things, Short Hints proposed preserving individual colonial charters and, sort of along the lines of what Franklin had envisioned, erecting a sort of new structure of government above the colonial charters. So it does propose a Grand Council, which would have 2 members from each colony, and these members would be chosen by the colonial assemblies, so they're basing power in the colonies, and these members of the Grand Council would serve for 3 years. And there would be a President General that would be appointed by the Crown, paid for by the British government, who could veto or approve acts of the Grand Council and would have the duty to carry them out. And the authority and power of both the president and this council would extend to Indian affairs, the purchase and settlement of lands that are outside of the boundaries of an existing colony, and common defense. And each colony would contribute to financing this new level of government based on some kind of quota that they would all agree on. So basically the Short Hints is suggesting something along the lines of what Franklin imagined. It's balancing royal authority and the power of the colonial legislatures, trying to sort of pay homage to both, making a limited sphere in which this level of government can operate. And Franklin, not surprisingly, ultimately was asked himself to finalize a plan of union based on what's laid out in Short Hints. And so the Albany Congress actually approved of this plan in July of 1754, and the Congress then sent a copy to the colonial assemblies for their consideration. So they come up with a plan, they pass the plan, and they actually pass it along to the colonies, which was a significant step. And this came to be known as the Albany Plan of Union, which makes sense. Albany Congress, Albany Plan of Union. The Albany Plan of Union was the most detailed proposal to create a union among the American colonies ever attempted before the Revolution. However, the ending of this will not be surprising. Colonial legislatures were not too excited by this idea for 2 reasons. Some colonial legislatures denounced it as an attack on the authority of the king. Others were afraid that it would undermine colonial charters, so although it tried to address both halves of this balancing equation, people protested it for both reasons. It's going to undermine the crown, it's going to undermine the colonies, the colonial legislatures. So not surprisingly, it failed. And as Benjamin Franklin put it at the time, he was extremely frustrated, right? I mean, he had this idea. He actually watched the Albany Congress kind of move in the direction, passes it, goes out to the colonies. Franklin's probably thinking, oh, I had this idea. It seemed like a good idea. It might actually go into effect. No. So as he put it at the time, quote, everyone cries a union is necessary, but when they come to the manner and the form of the union, their weak noodles are perfectly distracted. That's a very Franklin-esque kind of comment, weak noodles. It's also not a phrase you see that often in many sort of documents from the time period. So Albany Plan of Union, for one reason or another, fails, like other attempts at colonial unity that sort of faded away. And as we're going to see coming up, and even partly in today's videos, it would end up taking a crisis that threatened not just colonial well-being, but also what colonists perceived as to be their rights, to inspire the colonists to really band together in shared purpose as British American colonists. And that is what is eventually going to bring us to today's real topic, which is the Stamp Act crisis. However, before we get into the Stamp Act crisis, I want to give you 3 hooks to hang your hat on that lead to issues that are going to lead down the road to revolution. First is going to be Indian problems. The British have all this new land to administer. There's Indians on that land. The Indians are not friendly with the British Crown, and that's going to lead to rebellions and all sorts of issues, ultimately resulting in the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is going to stand in the face of settlers who want to expand west and create tension between British colonists who want to go west and the English Crown who want to keep them east of the Appalachian Mountains. And of course, the main one also is the war debt, and how that is going to lead to a series of parliamentary taxes on the colonies. So this rebellion was an Indian rebellion against the British all along the Ohio River Valley. And this rebellion was in the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War, and it was led by this man, Chief Pontiac of the Doag tribe. Now, in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, the British took over the former French fort at Detroit, Fort Detroit. And once they arrived there, they refused to allow Indians to procure weapons. This was a detriment to the Indians because without weapons, they were unable to hunt. Whereas formerly the French at Fort Detroit would give Indians weapons for fur. The French were interested in the fur trade. Well, now that the Indians were not getting weapons from the British at Detroit and they were unable to hunt, they needed to do something to fix their situation. And what they did is they rallied around Chief Pontiac, who raised a group of 300 Indians to attack the fort at Detroit. And although the British were able to maintain and hold the fort at Detroit and repel the invaders, this attack set off a series of attacks all throughout the Ohio River Valley, where Indians captured 11 different British forts. And in 1766, they did eventually agree to a term of peace, but this set in the minds of the British, that there was a very hostile Indian presence in the West. And at the end of the French and Indian War, there was a lot of West to go around. Great Britain inherited all of the territories that was formerly France. And so what they established was a boundary line to try to give the Indians a sense of peace. And what they stated was, we're going to create this line at the Appalachian Mountains. It's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And everything west of this line is going to be Indian country, Indian reservation country. And we are not going to allow English settlers to migrate west past the Appalachian Mountains. There it is. Now, this is going to be very unpopular to the colonists who were used to salutary neglect. And the British are going to maintain this border with a standing army of 10,000 British troops. So very clearly, to the colonists' point of view, no more salutary neglect. The British Crown seems to be paying attention to governance in the colonies in a way that they weren't before, starting with the fact that they are going to stop Western migration of the colonists past this proclamation line. Now, of course, the colonists are going to break this almost immediately and disobey this law, but this is just the first precedent of many more things to come. And namely, what we're going to talk about next is the war debt and how the war debt is going to be repaid, the national debt crisis that hits England in the 1760s after the war, George Grenville, the new prime minister, and his taxation policy, and the taxes he exacts on the colonies. And we'll be picking up right here with the very famous of these acts, the first few. Now we're going to cover the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and most notoriously, the Stamp Act.